Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me, for spending your Friday morning to talk about trauma. Believe it or not, this is my favorite topic to speak about. As Alicia mentioned, I've been a registered psychologist in BC since 2011. I have been working with trauma for the better part of 15 years, both in the US where I was trained and in Canada where I moved for work. And for, like I said, for the better part of 15 years, whether it was clinical work, teaching, doing research. Currently, I'm in private practice. So what I was hoping with today's talk was to give you just some information on how trauma impacts a developing brain. And then just based on my experiences as a clinician, some of the ways in which that can show up in adulthood. And then have a bit of a, hopefully save some time towards the end and have a bit of a discussion. All right, here is the BCPA slide I was asked to share. Thank you so much, BCPA, for organizing this. There will be virtual talks throughout the month of February. That should say 2022. Just unbelievable. And then the contact information if anybody would like to reach BCPA for any purpose. All right, we will be discussing some pretty difficult topic today. So, this goes without saying, if anybody feels upset or feels like they need a break, please feel free to do what you need to take care of yourself. You're all muted, the cameras are off, I can't see you anyway. See, I made a joke. I have no idea if you're laughing or not. So I have a feeling that's going to happen throughout the talk. It might be a little bit awkward if no one's laughing, but I don't know. I hope you are. But no, in all seriousness, please do feel free to do what you need to take care of yourself if you find yourself getting upset or activated by anything that we're talking about today. All right, I wanted to share this quote with you. I often get asked how I'm able to do the work that I do for so long. And I just love this quote by Dr. Bruce Perry, who's one of the leading psychiatrists in child development and trauma. Surprisingly, it is often when wandering through the emotional carnage left by the worst of mankind that we often find the best of humanity as well. And this is what kind of keeps me going, I think, in the work that I do. Just never ceases to amaze me how we're able to get through adversity, how we're able to experience, the worst things that humanity can offer and make it to the other side. And, as a psychologist in private practice, I see a wide range of clients, ages, presenting problems. But one thing that most of my clients seem to have in common is a history of painful experiences, mainly originating in childhood, that each of my client carries in their own way. And so even if it's not the focus of our work, it always seems to provide a bit of a backdrop for understanding their problems. So that's kind of how I structured my talk, to talk about childhood trauma, how it can impact brain development, and then how this can show up in adulthood. And again, this is something that I'm really passionate about, right? Helping people who have gone through adversity and have found their way through. And then if I can be any part of their journey, it feels like a big honor. All right. So I think there are a couple of important considerations that we want to talk about before we jump into the topic. And one of them is a question I get asked a lot. And this is the difference between a stressful experience and a trauma, right? It has seemed lately that the word trauma is used really frequently, right? So I just wanted to be kind of clear about the definition that I'm referring to in this talk. So according to the DSM-5, which is our book of diagnoses, right? Our kind of standard diagnostic manual. By definition, trauma refers to exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So this can include directly experiencing the event, witnessing it, or learning that it's occurred to somebody close to you. Adults can experience this in a number of different ways. Combat, assault, a car accident, just to name a few. When we talk about trauma in childhood, we also need to consider certain experiences that threaten a child's sense of safety, routine, and healthy development. So this includes the obvious ones, like growing up in an abusive or neglectful household, but can also include witnessing domestic violence, growing up in a household where one parent has significant mental health or substance issues, or experiencing significant instability due to parental conflict, separation, poverty, community violence, or systemic racism. All of these things threaten a child's sense of safety and security in the world and can have a tremendous impact on their development. There's also the idea of intergenerational trauma, which I won't be going too much into in my talk today, but just important to point out, right? The idea that trauma can actually be passed on from generation to generation in all sorts of different ways. So if we're all grown-ups, right? I'm talking to adults, I'm treating grown-ups. Why is what happened to us in childhood significant? Right, this is a question that I also get asked a lot about my grown-up clients, right? A lot of my clients will initially tell me, why are we talking about things that happened decades ago? What does it matter? Or they'll laugh at the old cliche, that everything is mom and dad's fault, and fair enough. A major focus of my clinical work is kind of present day and making meaningful changes in one's life. So why dwell on the past? And the answer to this lies largely in brain development and how early experiences can shape the blueprint of our brain. And so I want to take a few minutes to visit my friend, the brain. I love this little guy. All right, so the brain is one, if not the most mysterious, wondrous things in the universe. It is made up of brain cells called neurons, and neurons communicate with each other. They fire neurotransmitters to talk to one another, right? That's how the brain communicates. We are born with 100 billion brain cells. If you can believe it, that's about 10 times the number of stars in the entire Milky Way galaxy, about 20 times the number of people on the planet. And when we are born, we actually have the most number of neurons that we will have in our lifetime. So as I said, neurons communicate with each other through synapses, and they develop networks, right? They develop networks of communication. These networks, they organize themselves. Neurons organize themselves into these networks that form and transcend all the different parts of the brain. These networks are responsible for every thought that we have, every feeling, every decision, every action, the ones we're not even aware of. All of this is a result of neurons communicating with each other in our brain. So the way the brain develops depends on both our genetics and our experiences, particularly experiences in the early years. So it's the interactions with caregivers and engagement in everyday activities, especially in the early years, that really shapes the way our neurons talk with each other. And another important thing to mention is that the networks develop in a use-dependent fashion. The brain develops in a use-dependent fashion. Another saying, because we love quirky sayings, so another saying we have is that neurons that fire together, wire together. So what it means is the networks in our brain that are used frequently, especially in those early years that are used more frequently, those become more strongly wired. The networks that are underused become weaker. And the networks that are used most frequently, those networks become stronger and they become almost our default, right? They'll become kind of the dominant network of the brain. They'll become kind of the default way that our brain works. So again, important to remember, the parts of the brain that are used frequently overdevelop, right, become stronger. The parts of the brain that are underused become less strong, use-dependent fashion. All right, so let's go through each of the parts of the brain. So let's start with the brain stem that's in the back here. So if you kind of think of the back of your head, right, that's where the brain stem is located. The brain stem is the first part of the brain to develop in utero. It's the most primitive. We have it in common with lizards, so hence we also call it the lizard brain or the reptilian brain. It's responsible for what we call automatic functions, basically anything that a newborn can do. Sleep, wake cycles, hunger or feeling full, feeling temperature or wetness or like tactile discomfort, appetite, digestion, proper release of bodily wastes. And then the cerebellum is responsible for rhythm, balance, walking, and playing sports to a large degree. So since these are automatic and basic functions, we usually don't pay much attention to them, right? I mean, they're automatic. We don't think of them. We don't have to think in order to breathe, in order to move, in order for our heart to work, right? They're automatic functions. But have you ever noticed how grumpy you get if one of these parts isn't working properly? Right? If we're having problems with digestion, or we have problem with touch, with kind of discomfort, right? It really impacts us. Problems with sleep, my goodness. And if we think about it, most mental health conditions seem to involve some degree of sleep disturbance, change in appetite, or digestion. So when the lizard brain is not working properly, right, where there's problems with that part of the brain, it can have a tremendous impact on us without us even realizing. All right, so from the brainstem, we move into the limbic system. So we open our brain up and look, it's kind of right in the center here. Another way to think about this is if I kind of cut and flip and look in, you'll see right in the center, you'll see the limbic system. The limbic system we have in common with mammals. So it's also called the mammalian brain. The development of the mammalian brain really takes off after we are born. Its job is to constantly monitor external signals and internal signals and keep our body in homeostasis, which just really means internal steadiness. It's responsible for the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and, no, I can't say it on this talk, fornication. It receives input from our senses: eyes, ears, touch, and sound. It is the home of the amygdala, which is a little structure nestled right in there in the limbic system, which job is to detect threat. So much like a smoke alarm, right? It detects any changes in the environment that might represent threat, alerts the rest of the body by sending a tremendous cascade of stress hormones. This is a pre-programmed survival plan that probably most of us have heard, that's called the fight or flight response, right? It is the brain's way of mobilizing us to deal with threat. So emotions like fear, anger, sadness, right? I think they get kind of a bad rep these days, right? No one wants to talk about emotions, or it's kind of considered kind of touchy-feely. But really, all emotions is a pre-programmed way that our body reacts quickly to our environment and survives. Each primary emotion has a very specific trigger, a very specific bodily reaction, and a very specific action tendency. And so all that is, and that is really, it originates in the limbic system, right? And so the job is to detect any changes in the environment, to produce the most adaptive response, which is the emotion, and then that produces the action tendency, which helps us survive. All right, so the brainstem and the limbic system, so kind of the back of the brain up to the middle, largely make up the emotional brain, the emotion brain, whose primary concern is survival. So like I said, its task is to look out for any danger, or at the other end of the extreme, anything very special, like meeting someone you are attracted to. And it will notify you by releasing hormones, right? Releasing like a squirt of hormones through your body. And that is the limbic system at work. So we move from the center, the limbic system, we move up to our frontal lobes, these guys here, right? So this is the back. These are the frontal lobes, kind of like in this frontal area of our brain. So the frontal lobes is largely what makes us unique in the animal kingdom. Frontal lobes are responsible for language, planning, consequences, impulse control, and reasoning. It is the ability to feel very angry at your boss, but not punch them in the face, because we know the consequences will be great. So I'm very sorry if there are any parents of teenagers out there, but this part of the brain is not fully developed until our early 20s. So you know how teenagers aren't particularly known for their amazing ability to regulate impulses and plan and think about consequences, make good decisions. The answer largely lies in the frontal lobes for that part. And if anybody out there is a parent or a toddler or early school age child or remembers those years, well, how well has reasoning worked with them when they're upset? Right? How well has it worked to talk about kind of reasoning, planning? Again, it's because simply this part of our brain is not fully developed until our early 20s. Oh, I need to go back. No, oh no. There we go. So some interesting facts about the brain that will kind of provide a good context to understand everything else. So these parts, they're not separate. They all work together. So Dr. Bruce Perry calls it a symphony, an orchestra, with each part playing its role, but together creating beautiful music. Both the limbic system and the frontal lobe receives input from the environment. They both have direct pathways to the environment. The limbic system receives input from the environment more than twice as fast as the frontal lobes. We literally feel before we think. We register threat viscerally before we can think about it. Again, important for our survival, right? If we think about, present day, the best example for this is driving, right? How many of you have had the experience of driving in your car, all of a sudden, something darts across the road, right? A cat, a dog, a squirrel. Before you know it, before you've had time to think about it, you've slammed on the brakes. Your heart might be racing a bit. Your breathing might be a little bit fast. You might feel a little tingling in your palms. This all happens momentarily, automatically, before you've had a chance to think about it. Then when we come to, then our frontal lobes can assess that there's no threat or the threat is over, and we relax. But the point of the example, right, is that the emotion brain works more than twice as fast as the thinking brain. The frontal lobes are also called the thinking brain. I call it the thinking brain. And our reaction is automatic, right? Again, for our survival. So another really neat thing that happens, part of this pre-programmed survival plan, is when we are when the emotion brain is activated, when the emotion brain is triggered by a significant change in the environment, it hijacks the thinking brain. It shuts it down. When we are in a panic, when we are in a state of fear, our actions are pure instinct, and we have very little rational control over ourselves. In a moment of threat, this is necessary. We cannot be thinking, right? It has to be kind of automatic and quick. And adaptively, right, our brain has learned that when the emotion brain lights up, the blood flow goes from the thinking brain to the rest of the brain and body that's responsible for action, for survival. There are many analogies to think about the relationship between the emotion brain and the thinking brain. One that I really like is a rider and a hard to tame horse, right? So the emotion brain is the horse that's kind of, padding along until something scares it. The horse reacts. It's the job of the rider to tame it, to calm it, and to get it back into trotting along. Another one that I really like is that of the smoke detector. Sometimes it goes off when there's an actual fire. Sometimes it goes off when I've burned the toast. If that happens, once I assess that there's no real fire, everything can go back to normal. But what happens if my perception of stress and threat is off? What happens if I react in a panic, as if there's a fire every time my smoke alarm goes off, before I can really assess whether or not it's a fire of the toast? It can really kind of get me into trouble, right? It can really kind of keep me stuck personally, professionally, etc. And so sometimes, when we are very emotionally activated, again, which means the emotion brain has hijacked the thinking brain, we are not thinking very clearly. What can really help to get the thinking brain back on board is to use language to name your feelings by saying, I feel sad, or I feel scared, right? By using that language to name the feelings, it can really help get the thinking brain back on board and help regulate the emotion brain. As I mentioned, the brain develops in a use-dependent fashion, which means that the parts that are used become stronger and the parts that are not used get weaker. And so brain networks that are frequently used become the default response. So as a child, if my environment is one of love and safety, if I'm read to and talked to every day, then that will be kind of the default setting of the brain, right? My emotion brain will be at rest. It will know safety and rest. It will also know that if I'm upset, a big person will come and will soothe me and will calm me and will be able to take charge. And so my thinking brain develops strongly because it's activated by my caregivers talking and reading to me. It's not being frequently hijacked by the emotion brain. Even if it is, there's a quick soothing that happens. And my brain and body will typically be at rest. And so eventually my rider will become strong enough to regulate the horse. However, what happens if my environment is one of danger? If my emotion brain is constantly in activation, right? If the smoke alarm is constantly turned on, then that will be my default setting. The smoke alarm will be constantly going off, will be constantly loud. I will be constantly monitoring any signs of danger, any even kind of neutral stimuli, right? Perhaps a look from a teacher, or an email from a colleague, or a grumpy partner. Something that's fairly neutral will set off my smoke alarm. It'll be interpreted as dangerous, as a threat, and my brain and my body will react accordingly. All right, now we can move on to the next slide. So this is quite a complicated picture. What I really want to show with this picture, I'm not going to go into all of the ins and outs of the physiology, but what I really want to show with this picture is that stress is a full body response. Stress in and of itself is adaptive, right? So moderate amount of stress, mild to moderate amount of stress will help us mobilize our energy and resources and problem solve. It helps our brain solve urgent problems. If you have a deadline, right, that feeling of stress is what helps you meet the deadline. This moderate amount of stress is what helped me prepare this talk, right? Put some effort into it, think about it, work on it. In moderate levels, it's adaptive and it helps us problem solve. And what's really interesting is that the body reacts to physical and psychological stresses similarly. It originates in the limbic system. Again, if the amygdala recognizes an immediate challenge, right, it will activate, it will produce those stress hormones. It'll kind of send a cascade of stress hormones through our body to mobilize us. At the other end, when the stress is chronic, it's unrelenting, and is strong, particularly psychologically, this can really tax our system and overwhelm it. And so what becomes adaptive at the kind of mild to moderate levels actually becomes detrimental at the chronic. Like if by chronic, I mean it doesn't go away, right? We're really, really stressed for really long periods of time. And then at the end of that extreme is not just kind of a moderate kind of a stressful change in the environment, like a small change in the environment, but like a threat, a danger, right? And the body recognizes danger. It releases a huge amount of energy through the form of hormones through our body, which mobilizes us for fight or flight during the threat. So what are some characteristics of fight or flight? Most of you have probably heard of this and can recognize that, right? We have all experienced fight or flight at various points in our life. Our heart is racing, our breathing becomes shallow and fast. Blood flows from our brain to our limbs, so we're less able to think clearly. Our body empties itself, so we can wet ourselves or we can lose control of our bowels. This is our bodies making itself lighter, and is a very adaptive response. But however, sometimes in a trauma, right, not just a threat, but a trauma, the option of fight or flight is not available to us, right? Sometimes I think this is the essence of a trauma, right? When control is taken away from us, we are not free. We are not free to fight for ourselves or to run away. And all that energy, right? All that energy almost becomes locked in our nervous system. So we now know that there's a third response when fight or flight is not an option. This is the ultimate emergency response. It is called the freeze response. So when the brain registers that fight or flight is not an option, there's a huge amount of energy circulating throughout the body. We are not able to defend ourselves. We're not able to run away. The brain will literally physiologically shut itself down to protect ourselves from further injury. So the body and the brain become immobilized during the threat. Some will experience limb paralysis. The brain will flood itself with numbing hormones. Heart rate and breathing actually slow down. Blood flow is restricted. All of this is to protect ourselves from the pain and the injury that is coming. A lot of clients will describe a sense of dissociation, like leaving your body, right? They'll describe it's like watching a movie happening, or they'll feel that it's happening to somebody else, not themselves. Again, in the moment, a very adaptive response because it's protective. It's protecting your body and your brain from further injury. It's an adaptive response. But again, remember, circuits that fire together, wire together. So circuits that are most frequently used become the go-to in your brain. So kids under chronic terror, their amygdalas are firing out of control, and the freeze response becomes almost their go-to, right? Because it becomes really adaptive to their survival, adaptive initially. We all find ways of surviving adversity. We all develop strategies for surviving difficulties in childhood. And so what can become very adaptive responses initially in those moments can actually later in life keep us stuck. And we'll talk a little bit about that as the talk goes further. So to summarize, trauma affects every part of the developing brain. And what I'm really talking about here is prolonged chronic trauma, prolonged adverse childhood experiences significantly interfere with healthy development, because the lizard brain and the limbic system, remember the emotional brain, it becomes significantly overused, which means the frontal lobes become underused. Smoke is constantly interpreted as fire, and it is very difficult for the brain and the body to be at rest. We used to think that children are resilient and bounce back. A client of mine was yelled at all the time by her parents. And she told me she doesn't understand why she becomes so upset now when people are mad at her. It's something to the effect of, I was yelled so much, I should be used to it and not react. Now we know that it's not completely the case. Of course, this depends on many factors, right? The truth is children are resilient and grown-ups are resilient, and we are able to deal with a lot of adversity. But there are certain factors that will impact that. I have at the bottom, right at the bottom of the slide, but I'd like to highlight that first is the nature of the trauma. What happens? If it is interpersonal, which means that it comes from another person, it's within a relationship, right? It's within another person, it's from another person. Or if the terror comes from the source of safety, right? The caregiver. If the caregiver is the source of safety and the source of terror, the impact tends to be much more long-lasting and much more impactful. Trauma such as natural disasters, for example, maybe a car accident, they're seen as more accidental, right? The interpersonal traumas are seen as much more intentional rather than an accident. And it is also seen as much more individual, right? So it's happened only to me rather than something that happens to a lot of people or something that was accidental that can happen to anyone. The age at which the trauma occurs. So if it occurs, the younger it occurs because of the way the brain develops. Remember, like in utero, right? In utero, the lizard brain is the one that's developing. So if it happens in utero or right after birth, it's the lizard brain that takes that impact. And so may have pervasive impact on sleep, appetite, touch, or digestion. A toddler who experiences painful and repetitive sexual abuse may have no verbal memories of the event, but will be able to remember fragments, sights, sounds, smells, etc., but will likely not be able to have a chronological or narrative memory. May develop complete, widespread, and pervasive anxiety, or repulsion to being touched, and problems with relationships and intimacy in the future. An older child who experiences the same trauma may develop some cue-specific anxiety, and avoidance and distress. And the distress might come in waves depending on the reminders of the event. So we'll be able to some degree to hold the memory. There will be some verbal, some chronology in the memory. And then an adolescent with the developing frontal lobes may at this point be able to start integrating feelings of guilt and shame, kind of the narrative, right? A narrative with the visceral reaction. What I'm really talking about here, frequency is really important, right? Of course, it's the repetitive interpersonal trauma in childhood that's from the caregivers that seems to have the most severe and long-lasting effect. You know, in truth, probably most children who experience a trauma that doesn't come from the caregivers, that are surrounded with plenty of support and responsive parents, they will likely be just fine. Right? What I'm really talking about here is repetitive, pervasive, chronic trauma or adversity in childhood without adequate access to social support, mainly through caregivers. All right. So what I'd actually like to talk about here is this last point, which is the normalcy of chaos and unpredictability. Right? Another quote from Dr. Perry, we tend to prefer the misery of certainty to the misery of uncertainty. Alterations in the brain from prolonged terror, with the overuse of the emotion brain, the underuse of the thinking brain. We will often see more aggression, impulsivity, difficulty with compassion. Chronically abused children become used to the reality of violence, pain, and unpredictability, and loss of control. You know, this is what feels familiar to them. When placed in settings that are calm and safe, foster families, a therapist office with other caregivers, they may react with fear. And this is unusual for them, right? Because it's so unusual for them. So when we are scared, we try to grasp at what is familiar. I see this in grown-ups too, and adults too, right? If our template of relationships from when we are younger is chaos and anger and fighting and fear and unpredictability, we will be really uncomfortable in relationships that are stable and calm, right? We won't know what to do with it. And we'll react with a sense of fear. And so it becomes very difficult, right, to kind of navigate all of this as we grow older. I do want to mention a bit about attachment, and beyond the scope of this topic, to talk about all the different styles of attachment. Because basically attachment is our system that we are hardwired. We are hardwired with a system to seek proximity to our caregivers when we feel distressed. And the system is crucial for our survival. If our caregivers are consistently responsive and available, this helps soothe our distress. And we learn trust, safety, and rest. We also learn that when we reach out for comfort, we receive it. In abusive, neglectful households, caregivers are also the source of threat. And in that case, our brains will be in constant stress mode with no access to comfort or soothing. Our sense of safety and trust can also be damaged in caregivers that are unresponsive, disengaged, perhaps due to substance abuse, mental health issues, poverty, parental conflict, right? All of this will make it more difficult for our caregivers to be consistently available and responsive. So those early attachments, those early relationships really set the template for how relationships work and what to expect from relationships. And actually, that provides some context for this quote, right? We tend to prefer the misery of certainty to the misery of uncertainty. It makes actually a lot more sense to have it on this slide when we talk about how those early relationships really set the stage for our template of how we understand other people and understand the world. All right, just gonna get a quick check of the time. Repetitive childhood trauma impacts every part of the brain because of how the stress response neurons are organized, right? They span from the lizard brain through the thinking brain. This impacts our brain and biology and psychology. It can also disrupt our attachments and cause some difficulty with consciousness because of the dissociation. It can also disrupt our relationships to ourselves and to others. The overactivation of the stress response system becomes a bit of our fallback. The surge of stress hormones, the constant surge of stress hormones through the brain and body, can also lead to difficulties with attention, concentration, and dissociation. Trauma, repetitive pervasive trauma, can change our perception of safety. It can change the way our brain reacts to certain threats or certain triggers. It can change our perception of the world, right? And then again, what I see often happening is because of the underuse of the frontal lobes and the overuse of the emotion brain, and because we're then so busy monitoring our environment for any change, right? Any change of threat, this can lead to difficulties with attention and concentration. These can also lead to difficulties with emotion regulation and impulse control because our horse becomes a bit too powerful for our rider. And then, of course, it can lead to difficulties with our relationships with ourselves and with others. All right. So now that we have blown through how trauma can impact the brain and alter our perceptions of safety and threat, let's talk a little bit about how this might show up in grown-ups who have experienced repetitive childhood trauma or painful childhood experiences. Again, we want to make sure this is rooted in this idea that it's an implicit sense that the world is not safe, an implicit sense that other people are not safe, and an overactive smoke alarm in the brain that can produce visceral, gut-wrenching emotions. So let's look at what some common responses might be. So what I tried to do with this slide was really outline some common responses that I see in a lot of my clients as grown-ups who have dealt with painful childhood experiences. I want to make it clear that these are not indicators that you have experienced a trauma, right? These are some commonalities that I see across my clients that I know have had a history of trauma, right? And should not be used as kind of indicators or, oh, if I'm experiencing this, then I must have, experienced a trauma in my life. But really, these are really common responses that I see in a lot of my clients. Dissociation freezing. So we've discussed how this starts out as a protective response. But however, if this response is triggered over and over and over again, it will become the go-to response, right? So the brain, if it will perceive anything that is even slightly threatening, externally or internally, including our own feelings, they will be quick to numb out, right? They will be quick to shut down. So a lot of my clients will talk about feeling numb all the time. Or if they start getting an inkling of emotion, they turn it off. Or if there's anything remotely stressful in the environment, right, a difficult conversation with a friend or whatnot, they tend to dissociate really quickly. So what starts out, and you can imagine, right, this can get in the way when we are trying to function interpersonally or professionally. So what starts out as a very adaptive response, used over and over and over again, becomes the go-to, can now get in the way of healthy functioning. Hypervigilance, which is constantly monitoring the environment, constantly being on the lookout for any signs of danger. This is another one of those learned responses that initially was protective, but can now get in the way. So soldiers are a great example of this. I've worked with veterans and soldiers and RCMP officers for the better part of my whole career. And what they'll often talk about is, especially soldiers who have been to combat, This ability to be on the lookout in your environment and to notice any change, it can mean the difference between life or death in the combat zone, in that danger zone, constantly on the lookout. And that is necessary for survival. However, a lot of these soldiers then come back to home where it's presumably safe, and they're doing the same behavior, the same kind of checking on constant edge, and now it's really getting in the way of functioning. I have clients who were significantly abused as children, who are now always trying to predict what other people are going to do. They're always trying to be one step ahead. A lot of them will describe it as a chess game, always trying to monitor other people's behavior and always trying to monitor their own behavior so as not to cause someone else to be upset with them, as not to cause someone else's anger or to react with anger. The irony is that because we are so busy searching for danger signs, we actually have trouble paying attention to what is happening around us. So if our smoke alarm is on all the time, how do we know when there's actually a fire? Shame is an emotion that I see in a lot of my clients. Shame is the feeling that there is something deeply wrong with me. There's something deeply wrong with me as a person. Many people feel significant shame for how they handle their trauma, right? In essence, for freezing, for not fighting back, for not doing anything. You know, even though this was your brain surviving, this was your body surviving. A lot of my clients will feel a lot of shame around that. They'll feel a lot of shame around, you know, if this happened to me, then there must be something wrong with me, or I must have deserved it somehow. Often comes from feelings of self-blame. And this idea of shame will often become a central issue in therapy. Shame tends to be an underlying emotion of so many of our emotional struggles. Right? That emotional, visceral experience of shame is so isolating and so painful, and can really interfere with us being able to access love and connection when we most need it. Because the action tendency of shame, right, if we're feeling like there's something truly wrong with us inside, not like we did something wrong, which is guilt, but we are wrong inside, we're going to want to curl up and isolate. And this will interfere with our ability to reach out and to access loving support, caring support that can actually help us move through our difficulties. Anger is another emotion that I see as a really like a common one in a lot of my clients. Anger is a very powerful emotion. It will activate the entire body. It will make our voice get louder. It'll make our face get harder. We become kind of more scarier looking, right? Our body becomes bigger. Our voice becomes bigger. We become more bigger. We become powerful. And it is much safer to feel angry than to feel sad or ashamed or vulnerable. So a lot of times what we feel inside is a deep sense of fear, a deep sense of shame, or a deep sense of sadness, and how that will come out will be anger, which, as you can imagine, will also really interfere with our ability to access those relationships and our ability to solve certain challenges, right? And to navigate relationships effectively, to navigate challenges effectively. Addiction is another common response that I see in a lot of my clients. A lot of them have challenges with substance abuse problems, which have become their go-to method for coping, right? To quiet all of this that's going on that feels so unbearable and so intolerable. And then physical ailments. So there seems to be a really strong relationship between the experience of repetitive childhood trauma or childhood adversity and physical problems. Very often my clients who have significant trauma histories as adults will have autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, migraines, obesity, etc. So again, what I've done was try to go through a number of different but common responses that I see in my grown-up clients. But important to remember that these things, they're not specific to trauma, and they shouldn't be used as indicators that you may have experienced trauma, right? They're common kind of reactions that I've noticed in my clients. All right. So for this slide, I just really wanted to think about, again, just a number of different ways, like a number of different areas that my clients will bring up where they notice, when they notice challenges, kind of big areas in their life where we tend to really work through certain triggers and, and certain obstacles. Parenting tends to be a big one. And it's not surprising because parents with unresolved trauma, their inner world is one of turmoil, right? Again, that perception of stress and threat. And most of their resources, a lot of resources, when we're constantly kind of upset, we're in constant stress mode, as we've talked about, what happens to our brain and the body, most of the inner resources are going towards that more pressing demand of coping with emotional upset. Will make us less available to deal with external problems. So it becomes more difficult, right? For parents with unresolved trauma, it becomes more difficult to be consistently attuned and responsive to their children's needs. And it's more difficult to be accurately responsive and available because we're so busy coping with what's going on in our inner world. Another really interesting thing that can happen is often for parents with unresolved trauma, the look of fear in a child, right? That look of being scared, it can be interpreted as anger. And imagine how different a response will be if we see it, even our child, another person, right? If we think they're angry, if we think that they're scared, we're pulled to comfort them, to soothe them, right? Versus if we think that they're angry. If we think they're angry with us, wow, right? Especially if we have unresolved trauma, if we have problems with people, right? That's a trigger for us. People being angry, it is interpreted as a threat. Oof, the reaction is going to be so much different. With a disclaimer that there's no such thing as a perfect parent, right? We're really talking about the pattern of responses is what matters. And again, one of the reasons why our early childhood experiences are so important, because we tend to default to parenting the way we were parented. And without reflection, this can often perpetuate attachment disruptions in the relationships. Professionally, what do I tend to see? Right? I tend to see a lot of fear of failure. I tend to see a lot of, it's intolerable to think about failure, so it's easier not to try. I see a lot of stress response triggered by neutral cues, like an email from a boss or a colleague wanting to talk. If it's ambiguous, right, it's neutral, it can be interpreted as neutral, or it can be interpreted as harmful, as threatening. There's more of a tendency to interpret the neutral cues as more threatening. I had a client who used to cry all the time at meetings, right? This could have been threatened by a certain look from a colleague or a boss, or like any kind of comment, any kind of mildly challenging comment and she would have a big reaction, right? She would burst into tears. And of course, it's very, very understandable, but in a work situation, not necessarily adaptive, right? Actually really getting in the way, and really kept her stuck for a number of years in terms of moving forward professionally. Then, as we have talked a lot about, I see a lot of the impact in both intimate partner relationships and social relationships, in friendships. Again, our early relationships, they set the template of what relationships look like, you know, how I am in a relationship. And we might be very attentive to any cues of rejection and we'll react accordingly. That will be very threatening for us. That will be very triggering. It will trigger our emotional brain. We will react accordingly. We might also, just as professionally, right, we might also, and with parenting really, it kind of spans the board, this tendency to interpret neutral cues as threatening. So great example of this is partner comes home grumpy. And maybe kind of snaps at us if they come home, right? So that can be interpreted as my partner's had a crappy day at work and needs some support, which will have a very different reaction from, right, my partner's angry with me and this feels terrifying and this is going to send me into a wave of terror and emotion. And my emotion brain is going to be very activated. I'm not going to be thinking clearly, right? And you can see how those two different reactions, right, how those two different interpretations of the situation can really impact how we react and how we are in that moment. All right. We're making for a good time. I have one more slide and then we can do some questions, or two more slides, and we'll have time for questions and answers. All right, so we have been talking a lot this whole talk about pervasive childhood trauma and how that can impact brain development and show up in all of these different areas in adulthood. And the truth is, right, and I think historically, research on trauma has been focused mainly on adversity and mainly on the negative psychological impact. And if we think about pervasive trauma and the impact of brain development, that makes sense. However, there is recent research to suggest that the truth is most children, most grown-ups who experience a traumatic event, again, this depends on the nature and the frequency and all of that, most people who experience adversity be just fine, right? Grown-ups who experience a trauma, a car accident or such, may have some symptoms initially, right? Thinking about the event, nightmares, really strong feelings. This is healthy. This is your brain trying to process and heal. And for most people, these symptoms will resolve within a few weeks. For children, right, lots of research to suggest that children who experience lots of adversity are actually able to come through it, to thrive, and to grow. And, you know, I call this slide resilience. Resilience is this idea of being able to return quickly to baseline after a stressor has occurred. It is this idea of being able to maintain, kind of to be able to problem solve, to maintain homeostasis, right? To be able to maintain healthy kind of way of dealing with problems as they occur. Resilience is really protective. It's really helpful and can protect us against all sorts of different mental health challenges in the face of adversity. But resilience is not something that we're just born with. It is something we can develop. And you know what impacts resilience? There's lots of different research on resilience and resilience and recovery. What I wanted to do was outline my experience. Well, I see a lot of my clients who demonstrate this strength, this resilience, this ability to overcome, this ability to deal with stressors accordingly and adaptively. What are some common factors that I see? Big one that I see is routine, consistency, and this idea of predictability. So when we have routine in our life, when we have consistency in our life, when we know what's coming, right, the idea of predictability, we know what's coming tomorrow, we know what's coming next in the day, there's a structure to our life, right? It helps us feel in control of ourselves and of the world. The world is a scary, chaotic place. There's no way of getting around it, right? There's truth to it, and bad things can happen. And I think the nature of trauma, the essence of trauma, is that control is taken away from us. We feel completely out of control. And that's terrifying. So, this idea of regaining a sense of mastery, a sense of control, a lot of it starts with that behavioral idea of consistency and routine, right? That just really helps us feel like we have a handle on the chaos and unpredictability of the world. This goes hand in hand with self-care. Um, by self-care, what I really focus on is sleep, diet, nutrition, and exercise, regular, frequent exercise. To me, these three are pillars that are non-negotiable. These are the foundation of the house that we're building. And if any of these are wobbly, if any of these are shaky, it's going to make the foundation more shaky, and it will make it difficult for the house to be solid. And so I really talk about self-care. So taking breaks, being kind to yourself, again, focusing on sleep, nutrition, exercise. These things are not a privilege, they are a right, and they are non-negotiable. And the more these things are part of our routine, they're part of our consistent day-to-day, the more in control we feel and the better we feel, right? And the easier it is to maintain and to maintain self-care. Reflection is a big one that I notice. Reflection, how I think about it is the ability to think about our thoughts and feelings. So the ability to say, oh, I'm having a thought, or I am having this feeling, or, in this situation, I had this thought and I had this feeling, and how did that go? And how could it have gone differently? And what could I have done to make it go differently? All right. So this idea of being able to think about our inner world, I find really helps people almost have the sense of separation, right? So if I'm having a thought or I'm having a feeling, I am not my thought, right? I am not my feeling. I am someone who is having these experiences, and I can reflect on them and think about them. Growth mindset. Growth mindset is the ability to think about mistakes not as failure, but as an opportunity to learn. It's really the ability, and again, this helps us stay away from this notion of kind of fear of failure, or I'm a failure, right? And really helps us focus on how can these experiences help me learn and grow and develop. And then I don't know if this is true or not. I heard this anecdote about Thomas Edison, who came up with the light bulb. And of course, it took him like 5,000 tries or something like this. And he was asked, how does it feel to fail 5,000 times? And he said, I didn't fail 5,000 times. I learned 5,000 times what not to do. And so this is a beautiful example of a growth mindset. Every time we make a mistake, or every time we try something and it doesn't work, to think about it not as a failure, not as I'm a failure, but as how can I learn and grow from this. A sense of purpose or meaning in one's life, a sense of, this is my goal, I'm working towards this, right? This is a purpose, this is the purpose of my day, this is how I find meaning in my life, can help us help us work through adversity and work through challenges, that we have that overarching sense of direction of where we're going. It also helps us, with personal agency, this feeling of, never self-blame, not at all, never to blame for what's happened to you, never to blame for a trauma that's happened to you. But more of the sense that we are all responsible for the choices that we make in our life now, right? We're all responsible for our decisions and our choices. And the idea that we have control over our choices, we have control over our reactions, we have control over our body reactions and sensations, can be a really protective mindset and can help build self-confidence and hardiness. Right? So we can have all of these experiences and still maintain ourselves. And the sense of personal agency and the sense of purpose and meaning can really help us be proactive in problem solving and achieving our goals. And then, of course, our social support, the quality of our social support. So the one single strongest predictor of recovery, resilience across the board, when we feel like we have people that care about us, when we feel that we have a safety net, that we can reach out and get that support, extremely important, extremely protective. All right, and so I'd like to end on this quote, another one of my favorites from Dr. Perry. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. And we can all take a moment to reflect on this quote, and to think about what that means for you. I would love to hear some of your ideas of what this quote means to you, and any kinds of reflections that have come up for you as you've been hearing me talk. My references that I used for today's talk, and then any questions or comments or reflections. We have some time for that. And I'll do my best to answer all the questions. If I don't know, I'll just say, oh, you know what? That's a great question. I'll get back to you. The secret answer.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. So I've been noting down some questions as you've been speaking, so I thought I would just kind of go in order.
Okay, sure. Is there a way that I can see them? How can I?
They're just sort of all in the chat, right? But as people have been chatting, and they kind of get lost, right? So if it's okay, can I just funnel them at you?
Yeah, sure.
Kendra was wondering, she was curious about your thoughts and experiences with the trauma of the adopted child or adult, something about ambiguous loss.
Oh, that's wow. Let's start off right off the bat with an easy question. That is a really great question. What I see a lot in children who were adopted, obviously, we see a lot of trauma from in utero, from birth. Depends on the age of adoption as well, right? And it depends a lot about that the early childhood history. Most of the time, they are adopted into loving, supportive families that will generally be enough to mitigate the losses that children experienced early on. What I see a lot with adoption is questions about identity, more so than trauma. Although the trauma plays, right, we do talk about that a lot. Again, depends on what the kids remember, and depends on what the adoptive families were like. But a lot of what we tend to talk about is identity, in the sense of identity of who am I. And it can be hard if we don't know, right? We don't know where we came from genetically, biologically. What is our birth history? And those missing pieces can really impact our sense of identity and how we think about ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcella was wondering, since trauma impacts emotion regulation broadly, would you recommend treatment with DBT?
Yeah, DBT is an evidence-based treatment. What DBT was developed for was borderline personality disorder, which is a personality disorder that is kind of rooted in difficulties with emotion regulation, impulse control. A lot of people who are diagnosed with BPD, I don't remember the exact statistic, it's a really big amount, have early childhood trauma experiences. And so DBT tends to be a really helpful treatment to help understand where a lot of the emotion dysregulation, impulse control, and behaviors come from, and learn skills to manage that. Um, so yeah, really helpful treatment for specifically for things like emotion regulation and impulse control.
Awesome.
Yeah, but developed for BPD, I would say.
Faith was wondering if you have any strategies or techniques that you would suggest for helping calm down that sense of survival mode.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, right? And for anybody else who really resonated with my talk, and who really resonated with a lot of the things that that I brought up in this that we have been talking about, I would really suggest reaching out to a professional, to a counselor, to a psychologist. BCPA is a wonderful resource for accessing some support, to help with this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll be sharing the website that everybody can go to if they're looking for a psychologist as well at the just towards the end of the talk. So definitely feel free to reach out.
Yeah.
Uh, Haley was wondering if you know of a direct correlation between prolonged exposure to trauma and liver damage.
Oh, interesting. You know, that specific one I do not know about. Um, and then I would think with, with liver damage, of course, a mediating kind of, right, middle variable would have to be alcohol use as well, right? If somebody has experienced prolonged childhood exposure to trauma and then has learned to cope with that through use of alcohol, and then we would see, right, we would presumably see liver damage, but I don't know any specific, don't know a specific link to that. Um, Same with the second question, the correlation. I found the chat. Yay. Same with the correlation between early childhood prolonged trauma and later diagnosis of ASD. It's another interesting one that's don't know of any. It's not a cause and effect, right? We definitely can't say that one would cause the other. In terms of the correlation, that's one that I would have to do some research on. Um,
The next one was about how do you approach discussions about trauma with clients who present with these symptoms but do not consider their own experiences to have been traumatic?
Oh, that's a great question. I hear that a lot, right? What I went through wasn't so bad. Lots of people have had it so much worse. That's a really common one that I hear from a lot of people. Um, how I really like to work is through patterns, right? So how I think about it is that whether we have experienced trauma or not, we have all experienced adversity. We've all experienced pain in our childhoods. And we have all developed strategies for surviving that pain. Now, sometimes the strategies are effective and healthy, and we take those strategies with us into grown-uphood. Other times, those strategies can be adaptive in the moment, right? When we're surviving pain, it can be really adaptive. But later in life will keep us stuck, right? Later in life can get in the way from how we are in the world. So rather than kind of challenging, right? Rather than saying, oh, no, you really did have a terrible, awful trauma, right? I will definitely stay away from that and really just explore what the experience was like for that person, how they develop strategies to survive, and then how those strategies are showing up for them in their life, how they're working or not working. So I hope that answered the question.
That's some great advice.
Okay,
The last,
sounds like somebody is asking to say something. Can you?
I'm not sure if they are. Do you see something to suggest that or?
Yes, I see us.
Sorry, that was just a
Oh,
thumbs up.
no, just okay.
Thanking you for the
Thank
answer.
you. Thank you for that. That's great feedback. All right.
The other question I saw noted was from Riva. She's planning, or they sorry, are planning to study attachment theory in education. What are your thoughts on students being able to provide secure attachment, especially to children who have not received it?
Yeah. So when I guess when Riva is talking about working with children, or even in my work with grown-ups, sometimes we are the first secure attachment figure that people will encounter, right? We are sometimes the first, sometimes for children, the only figure of that, right? Of that sense of, they've got me. I can rely on them. I can trust them. They understand my emotions. They understand me for better or for worse. And this is, I don't know if I would call it secure attachment in therapy or not. I would say that this is a central tenet in working with clients therapeutically. This sense of trust, the sense of attachment, the sense of almost a co-regulation, right? Especially with children who do not have that stable anchor at home, for them to receive that from us, right? So their emotions are all over the place because they haven't been able to use that attachment relationship to learn how to regulate. Then they come to us, and we're able to provide that for them, right? By being that calm, stable, steady, anchoring force. And that can be quite powerful. And sometimes grown-ups will come to me, and I sometimes am the first and only person that they've encountered in their life that can be that holding presence. And that's a really, really important part of therapy and the therapeutic relationship. Let's see, anything else?
Yeah, there are a couple. Liz was wondering if you could comment further on your final slide regarding love in relation to people perpetuating unhealthy relationship styles and attachment in adulthood. How do you navigate this as a therapist, love and attachment that perpetuates some of the same patterns?
Hold on, I need to find this quote. I need to be able to see it. I'm more of a visual person than an audio person. Oh no, I must have missed it.
It's right it was just sent. It's a recent message in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, great question, right? Great question. That's definitely something that comes up a lot in therapy, where we tend to perpetuate the same kind of relationships that we learn in childhood. That was a few of my slides, right? That whatever is our reality, that's what we become used to. And that's what then tends to feel safe. And we tend to recreate that in an adulthood, right? In adulthood. So if we're used to relationships that are chaotic and unpredictable and emotional, and we will tend to act the same way in adulthood, and that perpetuates that pattern. So again, the first step is recognizing that pattern, right? Recognizing that pattern, recognizing where it comes from, and recognizing how those patterns might have kept you safe initially, but are now getting in the way. And in terms of the final slide, regarding love, I think that just speaks to the question that I was talking about a minute ago, right? The power of knowing that somebody else is there for you, the power of knowing that somebody else can hold your emotional experience, whether that's in therapy or whether that's in life, being able to reach out and ask for support, and really be able to take that emotional support in is so important. But in terms of perpetuating those disrupted attachments, that's definitely something that we work quite a bit with, and talk a lot about. But always in the context of, this is a pattern. It's not your fault. This is what you've learned. This is how you have learned to survive, and it's not your fault. And how do we start shifting this? All right, I think there's a final question. How will the symptoms like sudden startle reduce over time? So startle response, there's a huge genetic component to this, actually. It's really interesting. And I think it's one of the ways that we see intergenerational trauma, right? So if our ancestors have experienced trauma, this really sensitive startle response, we can see that in subsequent generations. I certainly see it in my clients. who have experienced historical trauma. I have it in myself, with my family history, this exaggerated startle response. And so there's a physiological component to it. But in terms of with a symptom, as your emotion brain starts coming to rest, as your perception of safety starts increasing and the brain starts to feel more at rest and more in safety, then these kinds of symptoms like hypervigilance and the startle response should also come accordingly. And then a lot of the skills that we teach, a lot of the relaxation, emotion regulation, those kinds of skills can also help regulate that startle response. So, all right. I think that was the last one. And I think that's kind of right in time, right on time.
Awesome. Yeah, I think so too. Well, thank you everybody for attending, meeting us bright and early for
Yes.
but an important talk. Thank you, Anna, for volunteering your time. This was an incredibly informative talk, and we hope both hope everybody found it as helpful as I'm sure as I did.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, thank you so much for saying that. Thank you to everyone who joined us on a Friday morning and who listened to me talk and talk and talk. It was really, thank you, Alicia. Thank you, BCPA, for having me on. I really love doing this and reaching out to the community and sharing some of my passion that I have about this.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you.